new. So if you already have been with us for the last couple of sessions, go ahead and go to the course. And we're in the last lesson. It's applications of best practices for reading intervention in secondary schools. That's where we're going to be all session today. Does anybody need me to leave the code up a little longer?
I don't see the code. I'm in the chat. Is the code in the chat?
It should be on your screen. Can you see my screen?
Oh, I do. I do. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We're going to be in a lot of breakout rooms today. So you're going to want, even if you are in the course, you're probably going to want to have access to this breakout room handout. I'm going to have one of my co-hosts drop the link into the chat and you should be able to access that. You won't be able to type on it. So if you do feel like you need to type on it, you'll need to make a copy of it, but it'll have most of the resources and the directions that you'll need for each of the breakout rooms today. And just while we're waiting for you all to get that open, let me introduce my co-hosts. We have Natalie Kleber and Wendy Brooks, both on the literacy team with us. They'll be in the chat kind of fielding your questions, dropping in the resources, and they may be popping in and out of your breakout rooms also as we move through them. Okay, so I want to start the session off reviewing. So let me hop into Canopy now. And are y'all able to see my screen well enough? Perfect. So this is the fourth session. It's our final session. We are going to be doing this one a little bit differently than we have in the past. In the past sessions, we've done a lot of getting new content and then going and practicing or answering questions together. This time will be much more of a cumulative session where we're going to take a lot of the information that we've covered in the first three, and we're going to apply it to some scenarios and some real life situations to try to help you kind of just bring all of that together and understand how the different components should look and start to work. So as a reminder, this is all grounded in the Louisiana tiered pathways for literacy support. We've talked about all those different tiers throughout the course, and we want to remember that this is grounded in 612 work. We know that we get lots of students in middle and high school that may come to us with some reading challenges, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to help them bridge those gaps and access their grade level content, because we know as they move through those grades, they're just going to be getting more and more complex text to work with. So we want to address those challenges as soon as possible. These were our objectives we've covered. We are looking today specifically at objectives 5 and 6. Those are what our today's session will focus on. Developing an understanding of how intervention should function, look, and be implemented in a secondary setting, and then apply knowledge of the previous sessions about implementing intervention practices in a secondary setting. I just ask today that you come with an open mind, you have some note-taking tools so you can refer back to them, and that you actively participate, especially when we're in those breakout rooms, because you're going to get a lot more out of the session when you're able to collaborate with some of your peers from across the state. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and actually jump into the review for today. And before I jump into the actual content of this course, can you guys just in the chat tell me if you are here for the first time or if this is something that you've been following along with throughout, just so I have an idea of how to tailor my review to the people who are on the call today. So just in the chat, tell me if you're new or if you've been with us for all of the sessions. Okay, a couple new people. And even if you weren't on the live sessions, but you were keeping up with the asynchronous work on the course, then you're not new. You've been here for most of the content. Okay. We've got a little bit of a mix in here. Okay. So those of you that have been here for a little while, I'm going to rely on you for some of this review. And those of you who are just joining us, if it sounds Greek, please ask questions if you have them, and we'll try to answer them as best we can. So I want us to do a little bit of a waterfall activity in the chat. And so when I put a question up on the screen, you're going to type your answer in and don't hit enter until I say hit enter. That way we are all able to see our answers at the same time. So let me get the question to pull up. So, well, never mind. Okay, let's do the first one. The first one is, what are some key words that describe tier 1 instruction? So I'm going to give you about 30 to 45 seconds to type in your response to what are, just the first question. What are some keywords that describe tier 1 instruction? And then when I say go, you all will hit enter, and then we'll see what you guys remember from the previous sessions about this. Okay, y'all can go ahead and enter. Let's see what we have. HQIM, whole class, research based, all capitals. Everyone receives this. Good. Core, all students, daily, explicit, still good. It's differentiated. Good. You guys remember pretty much all of it. It looks like. Hey, good job. Um, good. Yeah, these are all really good answers. I don't see any that are standing out as needs to be addressed. Does anybody have any questions about tier one before we move on? Explicit, systematic, good. Yeah. Okay, we're gonna do the same thing for tier two, just keywords that you remember that describe tier two instruction. And then when I say go, we'll all hit enter and put our answers up. Okay, go. Let's see. Core aligned, target specific skills, targeted instruction, small group, intentional, supports core curriculum, can use grade level content, good. Below benchmark on universal screeners, progress monitoring, data driven, very good with data driven. Closing a knowledge or a skill gap. Students that may have some challenges. Could use grade level materials in tier two, depends on the situation with the child and how what concepts and skills you're covering. Higher scaffolding, good. Okay, and one more time for tier three. Yeah, we do, Natalie. One more time for tier three, go ahead and type your answer. And then when I say go, we'll all hit enter. And go. Give me less time because I feel like I don't need as much. Intensive support, data driven, intensive intervention, sorry, individualized, progress monitored, students may struggle a lot, significant gaps on foundational skills. Thank you, Mona. Yes. Good. Additional intensive dose of instruction. Very good. So it looks like we all are remembering the tiers pretty good. We'll look at that a second. Now, one more thing, we won't do waterfall for this. This I'm going to lean on some of my veteran participants. If anybody could describe to us, you can do this in the chat, or if I would love it if you would come off of mute and just talk with us. Can anyone describe to us what is meant by instructional coherence across the tiers and why that might be important to struggling readers? Does anybody remember that or want to give it a try? Want to be brave? We can break that question down if you only know part of it. Like, what do we mean by instructional coherence across the tiers?
Well,
Okay.
is it that
Oh,
like all instruction needs to work together to support all tiers of the instruction? So the core, you have to have a strong core, and so and that should meet 80% of the student needs, and
yes.
then I'm having difficulty explaining it, but they just actively need to reflect one another and support one another at each tier.
Yes, they do need to be supportive of one another. And when we talk about that instructional coherence, first of all, yes, you were very correct on that tier one core instruction. If it's really strong, will get you about 80% mastery. But when we talk about instructional coherence across those tiers, and when we talk about those kind of being in alignment with one another, for example, in tier one in core instruction, if you have students that need some tier two support, whatever they're doing in tier two should kind of reflect the lessons or the skills or the concepts they're learning in tier one. So that way they're aligned instructionally and you're not using 8 million different resources when you don't have to, when you can pull resources you already have that are aligned to what they're already learning. And that's important for our struggling readers because they do need to see those concepts and those skills multiple times with multiple opportunities to practice and multiple opportunities for the teacher to do some demonstration and some direct and explicit instruction with them. So that was a bit of our review. Let's go ahead and hop back into Canopy here. I wanted to do the questions first before I just kind of spoke at you guys, but you guys really covered most of what's in here. We talked about that TPLS model and those tiers. And we just hit the nail on the head that 80 to 85% of our students should be meeting mastery if our tier one core instruction is strong. And that will reduce our need for that tier two kind of targeted small group for students who are having some not foundational, I'm sorry, some challenges accessing grade level content. And then you'll have an even smaller pocket of kids who are maybe having some significant foundational issues with reading that would need tier three support. And then just as a reminder, here is our, let me see if I can make this bigger for you guys, because this is, you can't see the whole thing. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna put it on a different screen. Is that better? You'll see the whole thing now? Okay, I see some nods. Okay, so as a reminder, we kind of looked at this chart in the past just to show you like a snapshot of who, what, when, where, why for all the different levels and tiers of support. You guys covered most of this as far as who receives the types of support and all of that. And as a reminder, just some recommendations we have for how frequent and how long the sessions of that support should be. We recommend trying to get as close to that 90-minute mark in that tier one core instruction as possible. And then that would allow for somewhere around 30 minutes of some small group within tier one where you can do extension or support. And then if you have students in tier two, they should be meeting outside of their core instruction 3 to 5 times a week, 20 to 40 minutes. And then if you have tier three students, they should be getting daily instruction outside of their core block for about 30 minutes. Just as a reminder. Then we talked a lot last session about progress monitoring and how important that is, because we need to have data to make those instructional decisions as students move through cycles of intervention. So we don't want them sitting in an intervention cycle for weeks and weeks and weeks for a skill that they may not need, or a skill they need, but they're not making any progress in. So we needed to have made adjustments earlier on. And we talked about making sure that we're using valid, standardized assessments to monitor that progress, and then making sure that we're plotting it on a graph so that we can see their trends and how quickly they are moving, or if they are not moving, towards their goal of that aim line towards benchmark. So that's just a recap of really the main points of last session, not the whole course. But what we're going to do today is apply most of that learning. So we're going to talk about tier two support a little bit more in action before I have you guys jump into this, mostly because and a lot of the feedback that we got, a lot of you were still saying, I still need some more, I still don't understand completely tier two. What happens in tier two? What do you mean it's aligned to tier one? Things like that. So I wanted to take a couple minutes at least to go over how you would kind of like structure your tier two support, how you would select the students that need to be in tier two based off of some diagnostic data from LIFT, which again, we covered kind of in depth in, I think, the first and second sessions. So I have provided you guys with some fake profiles from a diagnostic, but let's talk about these students that we're going to have in tier two. Those students are having challenges accessing their grade level content in their core instruction, but they're not necessarily always demonstrating a significant deficit or challenge with their code knowledge. So they know how to decode, but they're having some problems maybe with the upper strands of Scarborough's reading rope with language comprehension or things with multisyllabic words. And that's keeping them from being able to be successful in their core instruction. So we wouldn't call them weak readers, we would maybe call them struggling readers. And because of that, they're going to need some kind of extra dose of support or more intensive, direct and explicit instruction with those concepts and skills outside of their core block. And that's that 3 to 5 times a week for about 20 to 40 minutes. So because of this, it's really possible in tier two for you to stay within your HQIM materials in a lot of cases and not have to go to outside resources or to an outside program. Now, it is also possible that if you do have a program, you can use it, but let's talk about that coherence piece here and how staying within the HQIM can help you to build that coherence between tier one and tier two specifically. So it's not possible in every situation, but in this situation, we'll talk about how you can build a coherence. I have these students here, G. Boudreaux, J. Doe, and H. Thomas, and I've given you their diagnostic information after they've done the LIFT diagnostic. And if Natalie or Wendy, if y'all could drop the LIFT administration materials and the student reporting packet into the chat, I just want to kind of remind you all how we got this information. So let me go ahead and pull up it for myself. And for those of you that were just joining us, LIFT is a free screening and diagnostic that we offer if your district doesn't have a paid program. And you can go into sessions 1 and 2 to really get like in-depth information about it. But I want to go ahead and show you guys how, like, just a reminder of how we got all this information in the first place. So we have the administration materials and we have the student recording packet. You're looking at the student at a glance profile from the student recording packet right now. But I do want to go over some stuff in the administration packet very quickly. So in the administration packet, it does have all the materials you'll need to give the test. It also links the student recording packet there. It also is going to give you the calculators for like words correct per minute, and helping you determine like their automaticity and things like that. So make sure that this is where you go when you're trying to figure out if they're meeting benchmark and if you're trying to calculate what their words correct per minute are when you're filling out this. But the students would all read the fluency passage. Remember, we give that to them for 1 minute. We figure out how many words they read in that minute, and then we figure out how many they actually read correctly in that minute. And then you would go to the fluency norms chart that is linked in the student recording packet. And sorry, it's taking a minute to load. And depending on their grade level and what time of year we're at, you want to look for the 50th percentile. And that would tell you, it doesn't let me highlight, but this 50 right here is the percentile. If you're in 5th grade at the beginning of the year, you should be reading 121 words correct per minute. So that's where we get that information from once the students actually take the assessment. And then from there, if they're scoring below that 50th percentile, we would give them the code knowledge, which is where we see what the potential foundational gaps they may be having are. So if we look over here, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for you guys, if I can. There we go. We see that this student was reading 128 words correct per minute. When you click on this accuracy thing, it'll help you figure out, it'll give you this thing to figure out what their percentage of accuracy was. So they're at 94% accuracy. And then their expression, we have a chart in here that helps you kind of rate their expression. They were reading at about a 2 out of 4. Because they were not scoring above 95% or greater with accuracy, up here we said 94%, we needed to go ahead and give them that code knowledge inventory. And these are their scores on this, how they performed on all these different foundational assessments, or their knowledge of those foundational skills. So this student did okay on most of them. You see that there's maybe some issues over here with multisyllabic words. They only got 4 out of 10 correct on this. And then we have J. Doe, 127 words correct per minute, 90% accuracy. Again, most of their code knowledge inventory is pretty good until we get down to the multisyllabic words. I've only got about half of those right. And then H. Thomas, similar numbers, 129 correct per minute, 93% accuracy. And for the most part, really only missed a significant portion of the assessment, the code knowledge inventory for multisyllabic words. So all 3 of these students are grouped together because we want homogeneous grouping, and they're all showing some significant deficits with multisyllabic words. And so we've decided to put them in tier 2 support. The reason we put them in tier 2 is based on this data because we moved down the list in complexity. So like if they would have shown some significant deficits in CVC short vowel, that's one of the most basic code knowledge skills. If that's where their deficits were, that's where we would have started. But because they're not showing significant deficit until we get all the way down to the end at multisyllabic words, we know that they're not necessarily having problems with all of their foundational skills. They're having problems with their multisyllabic word reading. So we can put them in tier 2 where we can do some multisyllabic work with them.
Haley, is it okay if I just take us a second? I know we have about half of us that are brand new.
Yes.
And we have a small enough attendee list. If you guys have any questions, because this is Greek when you're just starting out,
yeah,
please ask us in the chat. Please feel free to unmute and ask. But just one takeaway we need you to have as you engage in today's learning is that as you see these student samples, knowing how to click in the student recording packet on that fluency norms chart, and I can even put it in the chat too. But you'll have to look to see, we're using one thing too, we're using the 6th grade up through 8th grade. Because the norms chart typically, you'll see some versions have it through 8th. It typically tops out in 6th because 6th is roughly the rate of speech. So we don't want students reading so much more fast than the rate of speech because then you're compromising comprehension. So we're looking at this fluency norms chart. We're assuming it's spring because that's where we're at. We're looking at words correct per minute in the 50th percentile. So if we're looking at any students today, they probably need to be at least 146 words correct per minute. and they need to be at least 95% accuracy. Those are really important. It's saying that the student's reading fluently enough to comprehend as they read. So if there's anything else we need to spell out from what kind of Haley just went through, let us know, because today's really going to be about engaging in how do you compute accuracy. So accuracy is computed based on the number of words read and the number of words read correctly, and that gives you the accuracy rate. And you can click on the little accuracy link to help with that. We have a words correct per minute in there.
Yeah, it's a spreadsheet calculator. I'm trying to get it to pull up for you guys. It's just the downloads are taking a minute.
Good
just so you can
question.
see what it looks like.
And feel free to keep asking them, guys.
Yeah, it's coming. It's opening. I gotta reshare the screen though. Okay. So if we had a student, let's just make up a number here in 60 seconds, because we give them a minute to read. Let's say they read 150 words, but they also made 20 errors. Then the calculator will show us that they had 100. That's not correct. Why is that doing this? There we go. The calculator will show us they had an 87% accuracy rate on that oral reading fluency probe. Okay. So you can use this calculator to figure that out. It's in the student recording packet. That's where we get that number from. And if they're not at 95% or higher on their accuracy rating, that's when we know we need to continue with some more diagnostic testing from the code knowledge inventory. So that's where I got those percentages from. So you would have to do that for each student after they finished their oral reading fluency probe. All right, let's hit back to the other screen. I'm sorry, y'all. My stuff is loading very slow at the moment. I don't know if it's just me. Okay.
I don't think it is. Other people are kind of having slow load with the Canopy too. So we'll
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that was just to show you I have these 3 students of a number of students I have assessed, and I want them in tier 2 support, because they're just showing some problems with multisyllabic words, which we see very often with our older students anyway. And they're not showing difficulty with actually learning to decode in terms of really foundational gaps. So we can put them in tier 2 and just give them that extra dose of support. And we can use our instructional materials a lot of times from tier 1. And I'm going to show you that in a minute to help them in their progress. So we kind of answered this question already. I didn't really didn't want to spend too much time on this in a breakout room, just because there's other breakout rooms that are going to be a little bit more time intensive that we're going to go into. So based on the diagnostic data provided, why were these students placed in a group together? Why were they put in tier 2 instead of tier 3? We just talked about that. We just answered it. They were placed together because they all showed similar deficits in multisyllabic words. They were all getting roughly half of those questions wrong. And we put them in tier 2 because they weren't showing significant foundational gaps in their ability to read and decode. So they're not showing need to be in tier 3 at the moment. Natalie, anything else you want to add before I move on to this next part?
No, I think the only other distinction if you haven't dove into the TPLS, the tiered pathways for literacy support, as well as the beginning parts of this course, it's going to give a lot more detail about distinguishing between tier 2 and tier 3. But one of the biggest takeaways in the secondary world is that these tier 2 students just in tier 1 are not getting the support that they need. Even maybe in a small group, they need a little bit extra, but their gaps aren't significant enough to where we really need to spend intensive time outside of the classroom. They just need a little extra dose of something to access and master tier 1 core. And so fluency problems, multisyllabic word reading would probably be indicative of a tier 2, unless you've given them tier 2 for an extended period of time and they're still not progressing. They may need more intensive support, and you would follow the decision rules in the TPLS guide for that.
Which we are going to dive into later. We're going to go through that decision tree later on in the session. So they're going to get to see that too.
And then we have a question in the chat if you want to answer that, Haley.
Oh yeah, let me go ahead and look. Do you recommend tier 2 instruction happens in the classroom of the teacher, or do you recommend small group? Okay, I'm about to talk about this. So tier 2, we know, especially in secondary settings, it's not always possible for you to have the personnel and the time and the space for you to pull people out into a whole separate times and spaces for tier 2. That's why we kind of recommend that 90-minute block. So let's say you have 60 60 to 70 minutes of that core lesson happening. Once the actual core lesson is over, you can pull students for tier 2 during that time if the core lesson has ended. So there's definitely opportunity, especially within a 90-minute block, for you to be able to do tier 2 in that core classroom. And a lot of times the ELA teacher is the one that is doing tier 2 intervention and support with their students. Tier 3 is more where you want more specialized interventionists pulling those students at a separate time of the day. Does that answer your question, or do you have any further ones that you want me to address there?
And just to reiterate, like in a perfect world where
Yeah.
you had all the resources and all the time and all the things, you could essentially have a tier 2 interventionist and a tier 3 interventionist. But for the reality of most of our schools in the state in the secondary realm, we just with scheduling and minutes, we don't typically have that allowed. So it really is on a campus by campus basis. It typically ends up being, like Haley said, most of the time, the regular education teacher that does that.
Yeah. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. I'm going to give you an example of using your HQIM for these students that we just looked at their profiles for with this little scenario. So these students, they're receiving tier 2 support 20 minutes at a time, 3 times a week. We pulled all 3 of them 3 times a week for 20 minutes. And we're doing it during their ELA block. So they have a 90-minute core block. So they spend about 60 minutes in core instruction. And then the teacher is able to pull students after she finishes that lesson for some tier 2 support. So this is an example of them doing it with their core ELA teacher. They're using guidebooks, and it's a middle school. They're looking at the unit Freak the Mighty, if any of you are familiar with that one, but I have given some clips at the bottom. They're going to be pulled. They've already been pulled for a few weeks now, and they've been progress monitoring. They're all showing some improvement, but they're still not quite at grade level yet, and they still need some tier 2 support. So they're making progress, just they're not ready to be cycled out of that intervention space. And for this example, we're going to assume that they have already received some extensive direct and explicit instruction surrounding syllable types, syllable division, and morphology. And so they're familiar with a lot of different morphemes already and syllable division patterns and things like that. So we've been doing a lot of multisyllabic work with them, and we're pulling it from this particular guidance that I've linked in here. It should be in your breakout room handout, but if not, we can drop the link in the chat. Decoding multisyllabic words in grades 3 through 12 guidance. This is a PDF, but this actually is also available as an interactive asynchronous course on Canopy as well. And the course code should be on your breakout room handout towards the end. So if you wanted to enroll in that, you could. But I'm going to quickly show you what that looks like. And they were looking specifically at pages 7 through 16 and 17 through 39, just to give you an idea of the type of instruction the students have already gotten. But if you look on this guidance, it's going to go through some kind of like context and background for the teacher for each of these things, like syllable division, syllable types, and patterns, and then morphology. And then it's going to give you instructional activities and things that you could use. So just so you can see what it looks like, I want to make sure that you're aware of this resource, because I think it can be a really powerful resource for our older students in tier 1 and in tier 2, because you can definitely do morphology work and things like that in your tier 1 support. So we talk about syllable types first. They've already learned the different syllable types. They've learned the syllable division patterns already. This is something we've already covered. So this is going to be helpful to know when we look at the lesson plan that I've made. And then as far as morphology goes, they've gone through and they've learned a lot of the different Latin roots, Greek bases, and things like that, just to give you some context. So that's what they've already done. For the sake of instructional coherence, and because I'm their core teacher, this is just efficient, I am going to start pulling materials when I can from my HQIM to use in tier 2. So I know that right now in core instruction, we're looking at this part of Freak the Mighty, lessons 4, 5, and then 6. In lessons 4 and 5, they're looking at a specific couple of texts. In lesson 4, they're looking at an article called The Benefits of Making Friends Who Are Different to You. And then they're looking at that text along with some other previous texts in lesson 5. And eventually that's all preparing them for this whole class discussion they're going to have that is based around all of these texts. And so when I looked as a teacher at that informational text from lesson 4, I noticed that there was a lot of new vocabulary and lots of opportunity to practice that multisyllabic word work that I've been doing with these students within that article that they're going to already be reading for my core instruction. So it's a perfect opportunity to take the same materials and just do some extra scaffolding, some extra support around multisyllabic words to help them better understand the content in that particular text. So if you go to the next part in Canopy, there's a PDF, and if you have the breakout room handout, it should be linked in there as well. It's a PDF to the article from the HQIM, and it's just there to show you that as a teacher, I went through and identified by highlighting a bunch of the different potential words that were multisyllabic words that I knew I could use in tier 2 instruction. Now, I ended up, for the purposes of today's activity and today's example, I didn't show you every single word on here. I went through and I kind of picked words that I knew would have worked well with the morphemes that I've already taught students and things like that. But that's just part of my planning process, is I want to go ahead and identify opportunities for me to use the text and the core materials in tier 2. So that's what I did first. Then I'm going to show you guys a sample lesson plan for tier 2 specifically. But before I do that, I want to remind you all, this is something we covered in our previous sessions, but just as a reminder, and for those of you who are new, tier 2 is where students need just a little extra dose, a little extra help with some specific skills or concepts that they're already going to be covering in their tier 1 support as well. So the best practices for direct and explicit instruction don't change, except for the fact that you're doing more of it. So they need more opportunities to practice, or with that guided practice and that academic feedback, and they may need more examples of modeling and direct and explicit instruction from the teacher. So if you look at the difference in their core instruction, their core block, they might have gotten just that one time where they got some modeling from the teacher, and then they did a few instances of guided practice before independent practice. When they get to tier 2, they're getting that extra modeling and then several extra opportunities to do some guided practice with the same skills before they're doing independent work. So it just increases in intensity as they move through those tiers, because as you see in tier 3, they get even more opportunities for all of those things. But we're talking about tier 2. So we're still doing gradual release, all of those things. You just have to remember that you do have time constraints that are different from the core block here. So I said they're meeting for 20 minutes at a time, 3 times a week for tier 2. So 20 minutes goes by pretty quickly in a classroom setting. So you want to make sure you have some routines and things in place that help make that time very efficient, which is where that gradual release of responsibility really does come in pretty handy, because students kind of know what to expect. We come in, the teacher shows us or teaches us something, then we practice it, and then we are going to do it on our own. They always kind of can expect that. And then some other resources just before we move on into the actual lesson plan, and I do reference some of these in the lesson plan. So I just talked about the decoding multisyllabic words, and this is the course code right here if you didn't get it. That's great to use in your tier 2 instruction. There's also another course that we have that is called the grades 3 through 12 content literacy series. That's the course code up there. We have not the course, but like the individual strategies that we have on our literacy library that you can access. If you're not in the course, you can see there are supports for reading, writing, speaking, and listening that you can use with students in any content area, but you can use it in that tier 2 and honestly in the tier 1 space as well. LIFT has some activities and resources that go with multisyllabic words that when you click on the student profile, you'll notice it was a hyperlink that said multisyllabic words next to their score. When you click that, it'll bring you to some activities and resources that you can use as well. And then most of your HQIM should have some kind of support built in for diverse learners, and it may have some options in there for you to use as well. That'll just depend on what your particular curriculum is. So I'm going to show you our lesson plans, and then you're going to get in a breakout room in a moment to do something with this lesson plan, if it will load. Here we go, it's doing something. Okay, so I went ahead and did the weekly plan. So remember, they're meeting with me 3 times this week. So, and I'm working on those multisyllabic words, and I'm using that text that they were already going to be working with in that core instruction. So I broke down my lesson plan for each of those 20-minute sessions into an I do, we do, and you do. I made sure to include any of the materials I would need, how long I'm predicting each of those things to take. And then I've got a spot to take notes on each of those students' reading behaviors during that class. Like if I notice that they're struggling with one particular syllable type in a multisyllabic word or something like that when they're working, I can put those notes down and I can adjust as I move through my instruction. So just to give you some context here, or just I purposely left day 3 blank because you guys are going to get together and plan day 3. But let me show you what they're doing day 1 and 2. So first thing they do, they're going to come in and I'm going to review with them, because remember, I already taught them the syllable types and division patterns, and I have some anchor charts already. So I'm going to review those with them for my kind of like start of the little session. And when I'm doing that, because we want to make sure that we're really paying attention to the best practices of direct and explicit instruction, I want to make sure that I'm still engaging them as much as possible in that moment. So I say something, then they say something back to me. I do something, they do something back to me. So it could be as simple as me saying CVC means consonant, vowel, consonant, and then making them repeat that back to me. Or if I had a special like hand motion that went with it and they had to do that back to me. You want them still giving you those responses back and forth, even though you're in that that I do phase, because you want them engaged as possible when they're doing the review of that. And then I want them to echo read the sentences where the word is found in the text. So I'd have those already pre-marked. I would read the sentence that the word is in out loud, and then I'd have them read that sentence back to me. So that way they're hearing how it's said correctly, and then they're repeating it. You should be listening to make sure that they're repeating it back to you correctly and giving them any feedback that is necessary for correcting them. Make sure you kind of explain, especially with our older students, explain to them the purpose of that echo reading. So the purpose, like I just said, is to make sure that they can hear the correct way and then practice saying the correct way. Then I'll use a syllable mapping method that's in the decoding multisyllabic words instructional activities kind of database that's in that guidance. And it's something that I've done with them before with other words. They're familiar with that routine. I'll demonstrate one time though with the first word, which if you look in my materials, I've displayed, I want the words insular, performance, discrimination, and stimulate to be the 4 words that we work with, because I remember I only have 20 minutes. And I'll take the first word and I'll show them that syllable mapping demonstration of how I want them to do that with the other words. I'll model it. I'll make sure that I'm doing a think aloud of why I segmented the syllables where I did and refer back to the anchor charts if I need to. And then make sure I'm pronouncing each individual syllable out loud correctly and having them pronounce it back to me correctly. And then we'll read the words in the sentences once again, but this time chorally. All of us will read them together. And then that's when I'll release them to start doing some guided practice kind of like with me and with each other. So they have those 3 other words, and they're going to do the same process for syllable segmenting and syllable mapping with those words for the next 2 words, because their independent practice will be to do it with the last word. But I'm still looking for them to be reading the parts out loud so that I can make sure that they're saying it correctly and then making sure they're blending it correctly. And then once we've done those 2 words, they'll move on to the last one. They'll do the same thing by themselves independently. And then I'm going to have them read that sentence out loud where it appears to the whole class. So that's the first day, and that should take me about 20 minutes to get through. Then when we get to day 2, I want to move on to some morphology work with them. So again, remember I told you we've already covered some morphology and all the different morphemes and things like that. So I'm going to start off with using my anchor charts to review with them the things that we've covered already. Again, engaging them as much as possible. I do something, they do something. We are constantly having that reciprocal back and forth explicit response happening. And then I'll make sure, because today I'm not going to go over every single morpheme we've covered. I'm going to go over the ones that are relevant to the words that I'm looking at today. So today, if you look in the materials, I want to use the words disconnection, integration, diverse, and validation. So the morphemes of dis, die, and shun, and in would be all the ones that we're looking at that we've covered before. Again, I want them to do that same routine we did. So they're going to echo read whenever I read the sentence out loud. And again, I'm listening for them to say it correctly back to me and give them appropriate feedback. And then I will demonstrate how to break the word diverse apart through a morphology matrix, which is also in that multisyllabic guidance with the first word that's diverse. And then from there, they'll do the same thing they did where they'll choral read it at the end. And then I'll have them do the guided practice with the next 2 words, and then independent practice with the very last word, doing morphology work. So now we have day 3. I left it blank on purpose. So I'm going to put you in breakout rooms. And I want you guys to talk with each other about what you would do with day 3 for these students. There's a couple different approaches that I can think of, but I mean, maybe you guys will even come up with something that I didn't think of. You have access to the decoding multisyllabic words guidance if you want to look in there. If you want to look on the content literacy series on the website, that should be linked as well in your breakout room. You can go look in there. But I want you guys to I'm going to give you a good bit of time. I don't know, Natalie, what do you think? Maybe start off with 12 minutes? Or do you think it needs to be more?
Probably definitely at least 15, guys. And
15?
just because like I said too, that we do have so many new people in here. I did put, some of y'all are having trouble accessing the Canopy course. So I just put like where this lesson plan can be found in the handout. I posted the handout link again. just to reiterate just one more time, like Haley went through, she had 3 students that she grouped together who were weak in multisyllabic words. She went in, she looked at the upcoming lesson, she looked for multisyllabic words in the text in that lesson. And now she's pulling these groups 3 times a week, 20 minutes a day, and she's doing these activities with them. And she wrote day 1, she wrote day 2. She has that gradual release built into the lesson plan template. On day 1, she's doing reading multisyllabic words by syllable type. On day 2, she's doing morphology. She's giving you the resource in the handout that's called Decoding Multisyllabic Words in grades 3 through 12. It can be found on page 1 of the handout. And so you might need that to see like what else can be done for multisyllabic words. But when you go into breakout rooms, you guys are going to kind of start to talk through, hey, what might day 3 look like? So maybe just start by kind of popcorning out some ideas and just kind of see where you sit with what might be the best idea to go with. There really isn't a wrong answer at this point. We understand that you are at varying levels of understanding that is perfectly okay. We just want you to be brave enough to try so we can work through arriving at a good place. And so if answers are kind of off for a bit, we'll get you back on board. Just engage with us and be brave and do this, and we'll get you through it. Any
Yeah.
questions before we put you in breakout rooms?
Okay. I think I'm going to do 4 breakout rooms. That'll give us about 5 to 6 people in a room. I think that's a good number. So it's going to automatically prompt you guys in just a moment to join the breakout room. And then once you're all in there, you guys can go ahead and get started. But we'll start off at 15 minutes. And if we need to adjust, I can adjust the time. So let's go ahead and.
Is that can sometimes be at different rates, but if you have a homogeneous group, they're going to probably be similar. But we want them to be reading at a rate where they can not only sound like they're speaking, but also be able to comprehend what it is that they have read. So giving that modeling, have possibly some choral reading where we're doing it together as a group. And then having them have that ability to do it on their own, the you do part.
I love that. Yeah, fluency is definitely one of the paths you could have chosen to go on for day 3. And I like that you were going to use a paragraph from that text, and I'm assuming one that had at least some of the 1 or 2 of the words that they had already worked with too. Good. Any other?
Can I say one more thing, Haley?
Yes. Oh yeah.
We also just talked about taking anecdotal notes as the kids were reading for the you do. And just noting, like, if they kept miscuing or making an error on a certain word or didn't pause at punctuation, like just having some anecdotal notes from that you do where they read the paragraph or paragraphs.
Yeah, because that data can also be helpful in their progress monitoring and like the instructional decisions that you make later on with those students. From someone from Wendy's group, if anybody has anything similar or different, like to add to the conversation. Might have to be you, Wendy.
Well, Megan had some good ideas. She spoke about using the mapping on page 27 from the documents that were given to in the I do and the we do and the you do. So that we practice breaking apart those words and then maybe finding words that are new, not necessarily the words they reviewed all week, but using that to incorporate new vocabulary words.
Yes, that's definitely another path you could have gone. If you didn't go the fluency route, you could have done something with more word work. And maybe this time, like you said, the students maybe go and find some multisyllabic words to work with. That's definitely a good option as well. And I popped into 2 other rooms. I didn't get to stay for the whole conversation for any of them. So if either of those groups would like to maybe share what you, especially that first group I popped into and I had to leave you guys, what you ended up discussing, I would love to know. I know my group that I just left, you guys were kind of just starting to bounce some ideas around. So I don't know if you finally got to a consensus, but anything else from either of the other 2 groups, I'd love to hear from you guys.
In our group, we discussed starting with sorting, sorting by syllable types, using some of the multisyllabic words within their reading that they are reading for that week, modeling that, having them work with it together, and eventually having them read those words on their own, and then progressing into fluency where they would apply it. And so we could take some anecdotal notes as they're reading on if same thing, if they're having problems, is this a specific syllable type that we need to hone in on, that they're having problems breaking down those words fluently? That's where we stopped off.
Mm-hmm. So it's very similar kind of track of what we were talking about in other rooms. Any other ones that anybody wants to share? I know in one of the rooms that I was in, there was a question about the fluency. They asked, like, could I do it at a sentence level versus a whole passage? Yes, that would depend on those students. You would know those students much better than just the pieces of paper I've shown you about these kids. So if those students are not ready for a whole passage or even a whole paragraph yet for their fluency practice, then yeah, maybe you are working with them at the sentence level on some fluency. So that's going to come into play with knowing the specific kids that you're working with. And that's where those notes, those on their reading behaviors actually become really helpful, because you would have the record of, like, historically the student has done better or worse with XYZ, and you kind of can look out for those things. So that's definitely an option depending on the students that you have in that group. So the ideas I had are very much what you guys came up with, the ideas of continuing manipulating words in that same text in a similar fashion with maybe different activities from the guidance, but still covering the same concept. Or because we progress monitor with that oral reading fluency for older students, we know that these students need fluency work. That's why they're in these groups in the first place. So we can continue with some fluency lessons or more in-depth fluency work on day 3 to progress it a little bit. So you guys were pretty on track with that. So good job. Any questions about that before we jump into the next portion?
I had some good questions inside of our little group.
Okay.
Haley, somebody asked, like, can you, like, completely, like, you start the activity and it's not going well, the students aren't mastering it, can you, like, change gears? And so we said, like, absolutely. Like, RTI is a part of this tiered pathways for support. And so that stands for response to intervention. And so sometimes we're responding to the progress monitoring data, but sometimes we're responding in the moment. And so you know, if we have an activity designed and you go to release and it's like just nobody is doing it, you can pull them back. You can do an additional model. You can give additional practice opportunities with feedback, or you could change gears and go all the way back to syllabication for multiple days or morphology practice for multiple days. So we just had some good questions about what can and can't happen kind of in that space.
I think it goes back to those, like, best practices of teaching. Like, in the moment, if you notice even in your core instruction that the kids are not getting it, you know, you might have to reel it back and do something different or model again or something like that. So yeah, definitely be flexible in your approach to meet the needs of the students that you're working with, for sure. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next little section about grouping students based on data. We've covered this in depth in previous sessions, but we're also, am I sharing my screen right now? I don't think I am. That would be helpful, wouldn't it? There we go. Okay, so the next section in Canopy is about grouping students based on data. And we're going to talk about, like, applying the concepts we've learned. So we've already talked about how we even get the data to group students, which is, first, we universally screen students at the beginning of the year to see if the screener shows that they have a risk of reading difficulty. If it shows that they are at risk for reading difficulty, we move them on to a diagnostic, where that diagnostic will give us the specific skills that they may be struggling with. That way we can make some groups and determine if they need, like, tier 2 or tier 3 support. So this was the flow chart that I had showed you guys of, like, the general steps. It doesn't have any specific assessments in it, so that would depend on if you guys are using Lyft or Dibbles or if you have a paid program that you're using, but all of them will follow the same general path. And then from there, another way to think about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 in terms of reading is your good readers are the ones that are above their grade level benchmarks, and they are all, well, you'll notice all of them have an arrow to tier 2. I mean, I'm sorry, tier 1. But your good readers, they're just going to be in their tier 1 core instruction. Then you've got your weak readers that you've determined from your diagnostic assessment. Those are the ones in tier 2 that just need some supplemental support. And then you have your struggling readers in tier 3 that need that foundational intervention. And we were able to get all of that from our diagnostic data. So you're going to want to probably have, for the next activity, the Lyft administration materials open, which are linked right here. And then also we haven't looked at this in this session, the TPLS decision trees, which I'm going to open and show you right now. And those should be linked on your breakout room handouts as well. So we're not going to look at the K3 ones today because we are all here for 612. Although they are very general, but, well, 412. So 412, this first one is just the general one to help you kind of determine maybe where students initially might need support and which tiers. But once you get them into those tiers, you're going to have to start progress monitoring them and making decisions based on the data that you get from the progress monitoring. So as you go through these tiers, it helps you to determine based on the behaviors and the data that you're getting from students, if you should drop them to a lower tier or put them to a higher tier of support, if you should change a variable that's happening within their support, things like that. So it's just a flow chart to help guide your thinking for each of the different tiers to determine where students might need to be. That's going to be helpful in this next activity. So just keep that open and use it as a guide. So you're going to use some scores from a student's oral reading fluency probes from LIFT. Again, I'm using LIFT because it's the free one that we've gone through. Determine which students require further code knowledge testing based on their scores and which do not need further diagnostic testing. So they've all taken this screener. I'm giving you their screener data. You need to tell me if they need further diagnostic testing from their oral reading fluency probe. And then that's all going to be in this PDF right here. I'm going to kind of walk you through this before I send you into the breakout room because it's several tasks. So you're going to first have this PDF. It'll load. This one is an annotation one, so you can like write on it on your computer. And I'm only giving you the data from these student profiles of just what they did on the oral reading fluency probe right now. And you're going to look at this and determine if like what should be done next based on this data. So I'm only giving you basically half of their student profile. And there's several students in here. These are not the same ones as what I showed you earlier. And you're going to determine who needs to do what next with your groups. Okay. So for example, if we look at this very first one, K.A. Bear, who was at 128 words correct per minute. And when we did the accuracy calculator, she was at 94%. Anybody want to get off mute and tell me what we should do next if she's not at 95 or above? Anybody want to be brave? It tells you right here. If the student score is 95% or greater, or is below the 50th percentile, what should we do?
Going to have to give her one of the probes to determine what's the underlying.
Yes. So this student is obviously showing some difficulty with her ability to read based on her fluency probe. So we need to move on to the code knowledge for this student. Now, if this student was at 97% accuracy, then we would know that this student is not really demonstrating any real struggles, and we don't need to move on to the code knowledge with them. So that's all you're doing with this particular activity is you're determining what the next steps are based on how they did on the oral reading fluency probe. Does that make sense to everyone, or do we have any questions on that one? Okay. So the second part, it's all going to happen in one breakout room. Then this is where you put your answer. Then I'm going to give you those same students, but I'm going to give you more information about them in this next PDF. And with this PDF, you are going to group them based on just the data you see on their student profile. So anybody want to get off of mute and maybe tell me what might we be looking for to determine what students might need to be in similar or same groups? What information will we want to look at?
I would look at if they were, I'm sorry, I'll let the other person go.
Okay, I think it was Wendy.
Go ahead, Miss Wendy.
Oh, okay. I would look at like who needs just like the fluency practice versus who needs accuracy practice, because we might need to go back to the decoding piece of it to improve the accuracy.
Okay. So that's a potential one. Yes, definitely. And what other data on, and this can be Wendy or anybody, what other data on this profile might help us to group students as well?
Well, if they're not fluent or their accuracy is, or their rate is 2 or below, you look at the coding, and if they are struggling in multisyllabic, those words.
Multisyllabic, yeah, that word.
Those words are there. I struggled with that word. But based on their skill, they're in the code knowledge inventory. So the like skills there. So if they're weak, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was agreeing.
Right. You would just, if they weren't fluent and they needed the code knowledge inventory, you would just pick them after giving that inventory, the skill there that they would be sorted into the groups by.
Yes. And just remember, I mentioned this earlier, but the skills on the code knowledge are listed from like least complex to most complex. So if students are struggling with several of the ones up at the top, they're likely also struggling with the ones at the bottom, but that doesn't mean you automatically just put them in a group with just kids who need only multisyllabic work. They're going to need to get in a group maybe with kids who are having similar lower tiered or lower level foundational skills. So you'll group them and you'll just do this matching activity to tell me which ones belong in tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. So remember, tier 1 students are those who are already performing at grade level. They don't really need any extra support outside their core block. Tier 2 would be students who are having some struggles, but not any real big deficits in their foundational skills. And then tier 3 are the students who are having very intensive foundational skill challenges that need like very intensive intervention. So I'm going to put you guys in breakout rooms and you're going to do those 2 activities. There's this discussion question also after it that you can talk about. And then we'll come back. Now we have less than 15 minutes left of the session. So here's what I'm going to propose to you guys. I know that we only scheduled to 11:30, but I also don't want to cut anybody's learning off. So I can stay on and continue this for anyone who is able to stay on past 11:30. And I promise I won't make it go all day. It'll just be a little bit extra. If you can't, I understand this will all be available on Canopy for you to do asynchronously, but let's go ahead and hop in a breakout room for about 10 minutes so that we at least have time to debrief for anybody who does have to get off. And then from there, we'll see if enough people want to stay on and continue with what we have left today, because we're about a little more than halfway through the content for today. So any questions before I put you in a breakout room?
So I'm just going to reiterate, Haley, if once we're in our breakout room, we're doing analyzing assessment data activity 1, activity 2, and then we're doing the sorting. Is there anybody that was in a room that nobody had access to Canopy? Or we have everything on the handout, so we're fine. Either way, right?
Everything is on the handout. They have a picture of the sorting activity, so they could at least write down which names go in each of the, So you're doing everything that's under breakout room number 3 on the handout, though.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Let me open up the breakout room. I know that was probably not enough time. I'm going to launch a poll real quick while we start going over these questions about whether or not you're even able to stay to see if it's like something we should continue to like further the session. If not, we'll be able to talk about how you can further your learning. So it should pop up on your screen. If you could just answer so I have an idea of who is able or how many of you are able to stay on. And then I'm going to start kind of reviewing the content. So how did you know which students needed to continue testing? Were there any students that you were kind of unsure if they can continue testing for the sake of time? You should have looked at if they were at the 95% or greater. One group we pointed out, they had some students that were over the 95% accuracy that we did continue testing. Part of that was so you can see what their data would look like and why you don't really need to test them, but those would have been your tier 1 students anyway. So just to give you an idea of what you should have looked like for your way you group them as far as tier 1, 2, and 3. You had a lot of kids who really could have been in tier 1. We had a few in tier 3 and these tier 2. These tier 3 babies should have been either in this one little group together or maybe even on an individual, meeting on an individual level with an interventionist. And then for these profiles, I don't have answers on here. So if anybody wants to come up on mute and just maybe recap what you talked about for the type of instruction that might be happening in those tiers of support, I'd love to hear what you guys talked about really quickly.
Haley, we also talked about with the top students when deciding whether to test or not. If somebody is on the cusp, like they're right on that benchmark line, you don't have to, but it never hurts to have further documentation and testing. And if you're the classroom teacher or you're connected to the classroom teacher, hopefully you are, then you would have other data to support too. So if they've been in tier 1, they're not progressing, we probably need further data on them to eventually get them in a tier 2 environment. Just one thing to kind of think about as you're filling these out.
Yes, that too. Those cusp kids, you should probably further test. Okay, anybody, we have about 62% of you that said you could stay on, so we'll continue. I promise I will make this as short and sweet as I possibly can for the rest of the content. But before those of you who can't stay hop off, I want to just make sure that we recap this before you go. So does anybody want to let us know what you guys talked about in your group as far as like what type of instruction you think might be happening for some of these different tiers? If you had any examples, if you even got to that, because I know we didn't have a lot of time, so you might not have gotten to this yet, but if you did, I would love to hear what you talked about. Wendy or Natalie, did y'all get into this in your group, or did y'all not get there?
We definitely tiered everybody. We didn't really talk about like specifically what activities could be done. We definitely
and that's okay.
Yeah. We definitely talked about, there was one student, we had a lot of questions, I think, around like, should we put them in tier 2 or should we put them in tier 3? I think that was a common theme. We talked about, just in resources at the secondary level, typically you're going to start that child out at tier 2 just so you
Mhm.
can service them, and you're using those decision trees in the TPLS to push them at tier 3 if you ever have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
But probably leaning on tier 2 as much as possible. We talked about, I forgot what his little or her little name was, but there was one, J. Pierre, that was just really struggling across the board. This is
Mhm.
probably somebody who's going to have to be pulled in a tier 3 pull out, like with an interventionist, because this is
Mhm.
probably beyond the scope of what a classroom teacher can kind of help that child with.
Yes, and that's one of the ones we did put in tier 3. Okay. So, let's go through. Does anybody have questions before we move on about what we did in that activity? So I don't want to like ignore questions, but I do want to be able to move on to the last little bit of content that we have in this session too. Okay. So let me go to the next thing. So this next thing is another breakout room, mostly breakout room, where you'll be looking at a scenario from this little student named Jessica in 6th grade. I do want you to have your TPLS decision tree pulled up, and then just keep in mind the idea of the simple view of reading and how fluency is that bridge between the word recognition and language comprehension to get the reading comprehension piece. That's why we always do the oral reading fluency probe with our older students specifically. And the idea of Scarborough's reading rope, where we have these language comprehension strands that is very familiar to 612 educators, whereas in word recognition, this is more of our learn to read. Maybe our tier 3 students are struggling a lot in this area. Just as a reminder of that, and having your decision tree pulled up, that'll help guide your thinking. So you're going to be given some scenarios, and I'll show you what it looks like on the actual breakout room handout, because I know some of y'all are working in there specifically. But in breakout room 4, it's got a part of her scenario and a question based on that information. And then we continue with more of her story. And then you've got another question. This one's a multiple choice question to answer about her. And then we give you a little more context to her story with a question at the end. Okay. We also have that for our 10th grade student, Latavius. It's the same exact process. He's actually only got 2 little questions to answer. So I know it's labeled as breakout room 4 and 5, but I'm thinking for time's sake, we may just do both scenarios in one breakout room. And I'll give you guys, let's say, 10 minutes, an agreeable time for those of you that are still here.
It sounds
I think
good. You might
so.
just
Based on the information that you got about Jessica, what was she struggling with? What tier support should she require? And how do you know? She was struggling with her word recognition and decoding. And tier 3 foundational skills intervention is probably the best place for her. I did hear a conversation in Natalie's room where we talked about the TPLS framework does say to kind of not to necessarily start kids there and get some data. However, this student is showing like very significant, just on their diagnostic, very significant foundational skill issues in the 6th grade. So we can make decisions for some students who have data like that to put them in tier 3 to start with. So she really does need some tier 3 support there.
one thing, guys, too, I didn't even think to say this, that the initial tree says in K3, I didn't make sure it says this in 412. If it doesn't, I need to make some adjustments. But it says for K3, if a child comes out well below on the literacy screener, then you can place them there. For the purposes of this activity, we're using Lift, just starting out with Lift, but you can absolutely, which is a screener in the first part and a diagnostic in the second part. If you're using Dibbles as a screener in 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, that child would absolutely come out well below, and they would be placed straight into a tier 3 environment.
Okay. Thank you, Natalie. The next one was a multiple choice question after you were given some more information about how Jessica was doing once she got into her intervention cycle. So based on that information, which of the following would be appropriate actions to take? And I apologize for the confusion on this question that there was, because it looks like there should be more than one correct answer because it's check boxes, and I don't think I meant to make check boxes on there. But there was only one correct answer for this one. It was to increase the time of each intervention session by 20 to 30 minutes. And see where she goes from there. We don't want to progress monitor like formally twice weekly with any students really. We haven't got enough data really to refer her to special education services yet. And we don't want to have a kid sit in a long cycle of intervention that is not working for them. So maybe we do need, and we only want to adjust 1 or 2 variables at a time. So extending the time that we're meeting with her would be the most appropriate one off of this list. Okay, and then we talked some more about after we made that adjustment, what continues to happen with Jessica. She's still not making progress after 3 more weeks, even after we've added in all of these different things. So based on the decision tree, what we should have done after those multiple intervention cycles and adjustments, the interventionist maybe should have referred her to the school building level committee, the SBLC, for some further evaluation to see what else we can do to support this child. The SBLC will comprehensively analyze her grades, her progress monitoring data, her attendance, and all the other anecdotal notes that she may have from her teachers to determine if a referral for additional services is necessary. So the Tier 3 and classroom teachers should continue consulting with the support personnel as needed and should use the Tier 3 progress monitoring tree to guide their next steps within the tiered supports. So she did eventually need to be referred to SBLC, but not at that point in time when we were looking at it. And then we got to our 10th grade student, Latavius. We have some of his spring LEAP data. He's approaching basic in all of his content areas. The data team used Dibbles to screen him, and he was just a little below that benchmark for grade level proficiency on the oral reading fluency probe and maze. But he already seems to be falling below expectations according to his embedded curriculum assessments that his teacher has. So he might be struggling a little bit with some fluency and comprehension across his content areas. So for the level of support we would want to start him at it went ahead. I'm sorry, I went back. I don't have the answer on here, but where did you guys say you wanted to start him at? I don't want to give you the answer because I don't have it on here anyway. Where will we start with Latavius? I know at least one group got to this.
My group said tier 2. They told us.
Yeah, I would agree. He's still having some difficulty with the fluency and comprehension, and he's having some trouble accessing his grade level text. So I think putting him in tier 2, seeing how he does through a cycle or a few cycles is the appropriate move here. So that is what they do. They put him in tier 2, and he's received in the past tier 2 and tier 3 support. So the teacher makes sure that when she's pulling her small groups in tier 1, that she's making sure that he is getting some small group time in tier 1 in addition to his tier 2 support. They're pulling from the content literacy series. They're pulling from the decoding multisyllabic words to work with him, and so due to his history of requiring tier 2 and tier 3 support, the interventionist decides that they're going to keep him in tier 2 for at least another cycle after they've progress monitored him the first time, because he was above the aim line, so he's making progress, but because he has a history, this individual student has a history of needing support, they thought it was appropriate to continue keeping him in tier 2 for at least another cycle and see how he progresses. So this is where you have to make individual student decisions. Like, yes, he made progress, but we also have historical data on this student saying that he has historically struggled and needed even tier 3 support at certain points in his schooling. So I think on the safe side, it is good to have him in another cycle. His next round of data after that cycle showed more progress. He's doing well with the interventions that they've put in place for him. So the interventionist here may choose to just transition him to just having that tier 1 support. However, you don't just put them back in tier 1 and then like never see him again and that's it. Because he has needed support in the past, number one, he should still be getting his small group instruction through tier 1. And there should be some kind of monthly progress monitoring for this student to make sure that he still is on track throughout the course of his school year. Because there's potential as he goes through more complex concepts in his courses that he may start to struggle again. And at that point, you may need to pull him for tier 2 at another point in time. But as of now, he's doing okay. He can just receive his tier 1 support. And that would have been it. Does anybody have any questions about that before I give you the last little tidbits of like resources for you guys? Okay. So I have some links in here for some support for the different tiers of instruction. All of them have been mentioned at some point or another throughout the course. I also want to bring your attention to these 2 links for the catalog of literacy support for teachers and then the one for leaders. That is where it's our big menu of all of the different supports that the literacy team specifically has available to both teachers and leaders. It's divided up by grade band, and it's also on the teacher one indicates anything that is like highly encouraged for new teachers especially to look at. So just take a moment to look there. All of these for tier 1 and 2, except for this book, all are also on those 2 documents. So you can access those just all in one place right there. And these links are on your breakout room handout and in Canopy. And lastly, there's an exit survey